Thank you very much, Dr. Robert Lustig, for giving us the honor and the pleasure of this brief interview. We are meeting in a nice hotel room in Berlin to talk about your book, The Hacking of the American Mind, which has just been released in German under the title of Brainwashed, so an English title still for a German book. It is a book about how corporate behavior, how corporate strategies hijacked our way of decision-making. Is that a fair description?
That's a fair assessment. It's part of the book. It's not the only part, but it's a good part.
So what made you write the book in the first place, and what is your intention with the book?
Well, it became obvious as I was writing my first book, Fat Chance, which was about diet and physical health, that there was an entire literature on diet and behavioral health and mental health, and it had not been put together in any meaningful way. It bothered me that was true. I had done research in neurochemistry, neuroendocrinology 30 years prior. I actually majored in nutritional biochemistry, worked in a neuroendocrine lab when I was in college. So, I had a long interest in this field. But I really wasn't ready or concerned about it until 2014, when I was giving psychiatry grand rounds at an American medical school. And they gave me a tour of the outpatient clinical facility. And the woman who runs the facility there, she was a former heroin addict. And so we were just, talking, and I asked her what being clean meant to her. And she said something that was so stark and so surprising, and didn't get over it. She said, "When I was shooting up, I was happy. What my new life has given me is pleasure." And I thought to myself, wait a second. This is exactly 180 degrees wrong. It's the other way around. I didn't question her. I didn't, impinge on her, personal space. But it really bothered me. And I went back home to San Francisco and I asked my psychiatry friends, did you ever hear this? Oh, yeah, no, this is a common refrain we get from former addicts. And I thought to myself, they don't know the difference. Mm-hmm. They don't know what pleasure and happiness is. And I said, well, I do. And so I wrote a book. And here it is.
And this book, of course, is not your first book. And the book maybe you are most famous about until now is, you named it Fat Chance, mm-hmm. Which is a book about the science and biochemistry behind obesity and metabolic syndrome.
Right, and sugar and processed food. I think the book here is called Die Wahrheit über Zucker. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's done well. About 20 different countries have published it. It was a New York Times bestseller. The reason it, I think, people glommed onto it and recognized it as valuable is because it explains the biochemistry of metabolism in a way that people understand, and it also explains what happens to food once it passes your lips, and people really don't know that. They've been told that all the different kinds of foods, no matter where they come from, end up in this one, engine, and the engine is powered by the food, through this thing called calories, and therefore it doesn't matter where the calories come from, it just matters that the calories get there. This is completely, totally fallacious. This is completely untrue. And I knew that was not true back in the early 1970s because I majored in nutritional biochemistry in college. And I thought that it was because of this myth that people had, which was being propagated primarily by the food industry, that this is one of the reasons we had this problem. And so I felt the need to explain in detail what the real problem was. Now, recognizing that most people are not scientists, you still have to put the science in, because otherwise the doctors and the scientists, will say, well, this is garbage, and, they'll discredit you, and then no one will read your book. Mm-hmm. So I had to have it there for them. And the good news is that the people who've read it have, basically agreed to the science. The science matters.
Absolutely. What brings a pediatric endocrinologist to write a book about sugar? What's that got to do with one another?
That's a good question. Well, so my research interest for 15 years was why boys were boys and girls were girls from the neck up, how hormones affect brain function, how hormones affect brain structure and synaptic organization. I used to grow neurons in culture and throw sex hormones on top of them and watch them go bonkers in the petri dish. That's what I did for a long time. It was hard to get money for. At the same time, I had this notion about what was going on in kids with brain tumors in terms of their weight gain. This is a disease called hypothalamic obesity. And as a neuroendocrinologist, I was charged with taking care of these kids. And I had a whole boatload of them at my clinic door that I had to deal with. And no one had any idea what was wrong with them, and no one had any idea what to do about it. Well, I knew a little bit of science and did a little bit more research, and I thought to myself, all right, I think this one particular pathway in the brain might be dysfunctional because of the tumor or the radiation. Well, if that's the case, then we should be able to treat it with this medicine. And we did. And not only did these patients lose weight, not only did these patients stop eating, but they started exercising spontaneously. And this was not expected. This was really highly surprising. One kid said, "This is the first time my head hasn't been in the clouds since the tumor." One mother said, "I got my kid back." It was really quite surprising, and it was actually quite consistent too. So then we asked the question, okay, could there be adults without brain tumors who actually have the same pathway and would respond to this medication the same way? And it turned out not all, but yes, a proportion did. And we figured out a way to tell a priori who's who, to be able to screen people for this particular neural pathway. And when we gave those people the same medication to get their insulin levels down, they responded the same way too. Stopped eating, lost weight, started exercising, changed their lives. And I thought, this is very significant. So then I asked the question, okay, what about all the other people who didn't respond? About 18% of the adult population, obese population, responded. What about the other 80-some-odd%? What's wrong with them? And so we did more research, and it became very clear that their levels of insulin were high, but not because of this neural pathway. Their levels of insulin were high because their liver was sick. And because their liver was sick, their pancreas had to make extra insulin. And the question was, why was the liver sick? And it turned out it was because the liver was taking the sugar in their diet and turning it into fat in the liver. So we started figuring out how to clear the fat out of the liver. And when we did that, those patients got better too. So what we've realized is, number one, a calorie is not a calorie. Number two, a sugar is not a sugar. Number three, it's not the fat you can see, it's the fat you can't, especially the fat in your liver, that matters. And number four, chronic metabolic disease is due to our processed food diet. And you can reverse those diseases by eating real food. And so, not only that, but now we know that several mental health conditions, like addiction and depression, can be alleviated by doing the same thing. And so putting all of this together, we came up with a, shall we say, grand hypothesis of how this works in the body and in the brain, how this alters an area of the brain, of cells called mitochondria. Mitochondria are the little energy-burning factories inside cells. What's wrong with the mitochondria? How processed food impacts mitochondrial function to cause these diseases and these brain problems, and how you can basically clear your body and your mind by eating real food. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Now, it sounds very new wave. It sounds very hocus pocus. It's not. It's all biochemistry. It's all hard science. And there are 600 references to the primary literature in this book, Brainwashed, that basically refer to the primary literature. And, you know, the neurologists, the neuroscientists, the psychologists, they're on board.
They're on board, of course. It's a very, very interesting, fascinating read with lots and lots of resources to get back to if one wants to dive deeper. Yesterday you spoke at a conference which was organized by AOK, die Gesundheitskasse, so a health insurance organizer for Germany. And you spoke about the issue of reducing sugar, or you spoke on the conference which was targeted to how to reduce sugar. It is basically because processed food is sometimes maybe a misleading analogy. Yesterday, a gentleman who spoke on behalf of the sugar industry tried to use this exit by saying, "Yeah, but there's lots and lots of ingredients in what we eat, and we should not only make a mistake on focusing on sugar." That was when you stood up and made a clear statement. Can you please repeat the essence of this?
Well, so what he said yesterday was that everybody chooses what they put in their mouth, and that everyone has free will and the freedom of choice. That's actually not true. Now, free will, personal responsibility sounds good, and people are for it. The question is, where'd it come from? Is it a God-given right? Is it in the German Constitution? Is it in the American Constitution? Is it in the Magna Carta? Is it in the Declaration of Independence? Is it anywhere? And the answer is no, it's not. Personal responsibility was invented in 1962 by the tobacco industry. Tobacco. They were getting killed on the science of tobacco and lung cancer. And they had to invent another reason for you to smoke. Well, no one put that cigarette in your mouth. No one lit it for you. Personal responsibility. Suffer the consequences. And they had gotten away with that for 30 some odd years, from 1962 to 1994. And 845 separate individual and class actions against the tobacco industry in the United States all failed because of this notion of personal responsibility.
Wow.
The point is that if you're addicted, and nicotine is addictive, you can know in your heart of hearts that whatever it is you're addicted to is ruining your health, your livelihood, your family, your community, your economy, and you are powerless to do anything about it. We have an opioid crisis in the United States right now. Okay? A person in America dies every 10 seconds from an opioid overdose.
Wow.
Now, is that personal responsibility? Do they all just deserve to die? How'd they get opioid addicted? And why is it that people are continuing to get opioid addicted? Is it really their fault? Did they prescribe the opioids for themselves? Really? So this whole concept of personal responsibility falls apart when we're talking about either addictive substances or addictive behaviors. Addictive substances like cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, or behaviors.
Can I just cut in here? You are Professor Emeritus at UCSF in California, in San Francisco. Professor Emeritus means you have no teaching obligations, but are still engaged in research.
Right. So basically, I still do have teaching obligations.
Okay.
I have no clinical obligations.
Okay.
So I've clinically retired. I was a pediatrician for 40 years. And I realized several years ago that I could treat 1 million kids easier than I could treat one. And that I had a different calling, and that the clinical work was actually getting in the way of the research and the policy work. And so when I turned 60, and I was able to go emeritus professor, which gives you certain advantages and you can start drawing pension, I decided that this was now a better use of my time.
Right. And it is not for me to congratulate you on this decision.
No,
but
not at all.
We are very happy that you have made this decision to...
my patients aren't.
I am very happy that you've made this decision to research and to write books. The point I was trying to get at, and I'm making now, is yesterday we sat, or you sat in front, or you sat next to the head of the German Max-Rubner-Institut, so a very high-ranking civil servant, but a scientist who is in charge of evaluating scientific evidence for health policy decisions. And
this is Dr. Bernard Watzel.
Yes, and he heard you mention sugar and it being addictive, and he said that was one theory of yours. What is your answer to this? How sound are we?
So I have two responses. The first is that no one argues that sugar causes dopamine release. We have the data. I mean, we have the functional MRI studies, we have the PET scan studies. That's not opinion, that's fact. And it turns out, from a purely teleologic standpoint, every single substance or behavior that causes dopamine release in the extreme leads to an addiction. So there's shopaholic, sexaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic.
Workaholic.
Okay, workaholic, yes. Every single thing that causes pleasure, causes dopamine release in the extreme will lead to addiction. Pornography addiction, sex addiction. Pick your pleasure in the extreme. That's what you get. Sugar is no different. So that's the teleologic explanation. The empiric explanation is that we actually have the data to show what happens. Now, part of the reason why there's this fight about whether sugar is addictive is because the definition of addiction just recently changed 5 years ago. So in America, the American Psychiatric Association is in charge of the definitions and the nomenclature. Prior to 2013, only substances could be addictive. There were no behavioral addictions. So cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, morphine, heroin, those were easy, no problem. But they needed to be able to include behavioral addictions under the same rubric in order to be able to provide money for clinical services. The one they started with was gambling addiction. And the reason was because they could actually show the same brain changes in gambling addiction that they did in any substance addiction. Now, gambling's not a substance. And so what they had to do is they had to change the definition. So prior to 2013, you needed two criteria for addiction. Tolerance, that is, more gives you less, and withdrawal. Abstinence makes you sick. Now, withdrawal is the effects of these substances on the entire body, not on the brain, but on the entire body, because these substances have effects on the entire body. There are receptors for these substances everywhere. Obviously, behaviors are all in the brain, so you're not going to have withdrawal. So what they did was they changed the definition to tolerance and dependence. And dependence has very specific criteria. You think about it all the time. It interferes with your work. You can't get away from it. You actually, spend money to, make it happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So there are a whole host of criteria for dependence. And under the rubric of tolerance and dependence, gambling fits, social media fits, shopping fits, pornography fits, and guess what? Sugar fits too. So sugar does induce tolerance and dependence. It does not induce tolerance and withdrawal. But it doesn't matter because now the definition is tolerance and dependence. The gentleman who had this question about my opinion is not up on his psychiatry.
Dr. Lustig, thank you very much. You have a very, very busy schedule. We've been extremely fortunate to get the possibility to take this few questions to you, and we're grateful for your answers. All the very best to you and your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Uwe. You've been most kind and most gracious, and I appreciate it.